Hello, I'm Harley Schlanger. Welcome to our weekly dialogue with Helga Zepp-LaRouche, the founder and chairwoman of the Schiller Institute. It's February 16th, 2022. Helga, this is the day that we were told by US and NATO intelligence that Russia would be invading Ukraine. As far as the latest intelligence I have, that hasn't happened yet. But this has been a steady drumbeat over the last 2 months at least, insisting that the Russians are preparing for an invasion and the West has to be prepared for countermeasures. Why don't we start with what you know about the situation on the ground and how this thing is moving as of this moment?
Well, I think I agree with Maria Zakharova, the spokeswoman for the Russian Foreign Ministry, who hilariously said that February 15th will go down in history as the day where Western propaganda proved to be a complete failure. Now, I think for the time being, the immediate war danger for sure does not exist. That doesn't mean it's not there as an underlying cause, but the drumbeat, which had been initiated, I think, beginning with Avril Haines going to brief the NATO ambassadors in Brussels about the pending Russian invasion of Ukraine, which I think was sometimes in October or November, that for sure has proven to be bad intelligence or propaganda drumbeat to demonize Russia. I mean, remember that the Russian troops, which were in part still are along the Ukrainian border, was for two reasons. One, for sure, and that was never mentioned in the Western media at all, that you have at the same time 100,000 troops, Ukrainian troops, mixed with right-wing elements along the borderline with the Donbass. And that was, pointed out to by very few people on the ground, like one parliamentarian from the left party in Germany, that the reason why these Russian troops were there is because these Ukrainian troops were there, and there were all these reports about pending false flag operations, and that obviously is one of the means with how such things are conducted. The other major thing, and that was an argument which was made by a former general inspector of the German Bundeswehr, General Kujat, that he thought that the deployment of these Russian troops on Russian territory, which is perfectly fine, and other countries deploy troops on their own territory all the time, was meant to be a threatening environment to force a discussion about the demands by Putin to the US and NATO to have security guarantees that NATO would not expand further to the east, and that no offensive weapon systems would be installed along the Russian border, and that Ukraine would not become a member of NATO, because that has very little to do with the right of Ukraine to choose its own alliance. It has to do everything that security is one, and you cannot improve your security at the expense of the others. So to force a discussion, Putin decided to put these troops there. And I must say, that part of it definitely functioned, because you had never such a hectic diplomacy going on like in the last several weeks and even the last several days. So, so the immediate drumbeat, which from the British came like even days before that, today at 3 o'clock, there will be the Russian invasion. Then you had all this hysteria being generated by US diplomats and other Americans being called out of Ukraine. And even after the interesting meeting between German Chancellor Scholz and Putin, President Biden this morning even said, he doesn't believe that these troops have been withdrawn. and further proof is necessary. So they have obviously gotten themselves into such a hype that it blinded the view of what the actual situation is on the ground. So now Shoigu, the Russian defense minister, briefed President Putin and said, one drill is over, so we're pulling back some of the troops. Another drill is still going on for a few days. And then after that, those troops will be withdrawn as well. So I think that the immediate, danger, or the, portrayed danger of impending war definitely is more like what the Russians said, because Putin and Lavrov and others said all the time there is no plan to invade Ukraine. So I think what Maria Zakharova said is actually quite to the point.
And other commentators are saying that the hype is designed to divert the problems that Biden is having politically in the United States by building up this war threat, building up the idea of NATO unity because of Biden's leadership, the demand that they're unified around harsh sanctions. Therefore, the Russians back down so you can declare it a victory. I think Zakharova also mentioned that. But you mentioned the Scholz meeting with Putin. This seems to be quite significant coming after the Macron meeting. There wasn't a whole lot initially in the press about it, but I know there were releases from both parties today. What can you tell us about that meeting?
Well, I think it was after almost 6 hours Macron-Putin. This was more than 3 hours between Scholz and Putin. And the press conference they gave afterwards, I think, reflects some motion forward. I think that Scholz got some agreement from Zelensky, because the situation in Ukraine is also extremely complicated, and we can mention that a little bit later. But there is apparently a first draft bill which Zelensky gave to Schulz about what will happen to the Donbass. So this is like the very first step towards a Minsk agreement. And naturally, this requires some more negotiations and so forth. But I think what struck me most when I listened to Scholz in his statement after the meeting with Putin, I mean, Scholz is not exactly an emotional person, and he's not very outgoing. But I thought for his conditions, he was almost emotional. I mean, I'm saying almost, because he said the most important task of leaders in Europe is to make sure that peace and security is being kept. And I think that is definitely something which I believe that he really means, because the idea of war in Europe has a completely different connotation and memory for people in Europe than for those in the United States. We had 2 world wars on European territory, and the memory of that is burned into the genes, so to speak, of every family, even so the younger generation sometimes seems to lose a little bit of that. But at least the older people, who maybe not lived through that, but have the memories of what their parents and grandparents were communicating. I think the idea to have war in Europe is such a horrible idea that I think this really is something which Europeans at this point, at least those Europeans who are Europeans and not some transatlantic puppets, they really want to do everything to maintain peace. And I think this is what motivated Macron and also Scholz. So I think this is an important step. Obviously, a lot more has to happen, but we definitely moved away from the brink which the British and certain people in the United States tried to drive the world towards. And now I hope that diplomacy can play a bigger role again.
Well, speaking of the brink, if you watched what's being done with the American population or the US people who are in Ukraine, they were told to evacuate. The embassy was moved to the west of Ukraine. And you just got a communication from Natalia Vitrenko, a very significant political figure in Ukraine, an economist, a longtime friend of yours and Lyndon LaRouche. And she had some comments about what it's like in Kiev that I think would be very useful for you to share with the audience.
Yeah, I think Natalia Vitrenko is an outstanding economist, stateswoman in Ukraine. She was a presidential candidate repeatedly until the present machine prevented her from having this role. And she basically described how the internal situation in Ukraine is very factionalized. You have on the one side those people who got really scared, and Zelensky being one of them, realizing that Ukraine would gain nothing out of a confrontation between NATO and Russia, or Ukraine and Russia, and that the real problem is that the Ukrainian economy is completely flat and collapsing. And then naturally there are those elements who are more linked to the right wing, to the Stepan Bandera tradition, those elements which were mainly instrumental in making the coup in Maidan in 2014. And these people would not mind a war, and that naturally Zelensky is maneuvering, because he thinks that if he goes for a Minsk agreement, that these right-wing circles would get rid of him, or try to get rid of him. And so the situation inside Ukraine is extremely difficult. The living standard did not grow. Unlike the other Warsaw Pact countries, the living standard is about the level of 1990, when the Warsaw Pact dissolved. So I think Ukraine is definitely has nothing to win and all to lose if it would come to a war. And I think that is why you need to listen to the more reasonable people inside Ukraine, and you have to create the condition overall where the Ukrainian economy could play the role which they should play, namely to be a bridge between East and West, integrated maybe in an integration between Europe and Eurasian Economic Union and the Belt and Road Initiative. There must be a perspective to uplift the Ukrainian economy in such a larger context.
Now, when we're talking about crazy Ukrainians, we have this character who's the ambassador to Germany, Melnik, who is doing everything he can to spread hatred of Russia. What should people make of this guy?
Well, he gets an enormous amount of publicity in all the talk shows. You turn on the TV, and every second day, that's at least the felt impression, this guy is there and really warmongering and spouting hate speech. And it's interesting that he is on the record that he is an admirer of Stepan Bandera. And when the question was that the statue of Bandera, who collaborated with the Nazis in many crimes, was put up, he endorsed it and praised it. So the people in the West are obviously not having any problems with these elements in Ukraine, and that was even criticized very heavily by Israel, because their people are extremely sensitive about these traditions for the obvious reasons. So I think the Melnik is definitely a puppet of somebody.
Now, you mentioned the Minsk Accords earlier, and this is becoming a central feature of the discussion, because the Ukrainians have balked at following through the agreement that they signed to negotiate with the people in the eastern part of the country. Do you think there was some motion on this? You mentioned something about Scholz bringing this to Putin. This would seem to be an extremely important aspect of breaking the war danger.
Yes, no, I think there is some motion. I think there is also some discussion that you not only need Minsk II, an agreement, some autonomy to the Donbass, but you need actually a larger approach, namely, Helsinki 2 has been brought up, and I think that is definitely the minimum which is needed, a security architecture where everybody can live with. But, I have made the point that I think even Helsinki 2 is not enough because, NATO is obsolete. NATO has turned into a pact of aggression, which does to say that it does not respect the security interest of NATO or China, for that matter, is almost an understatement of the year. I have said what we need an international new security architecture which takes into account the security interest of every single country, at least for Eurasia. That would mean, including Russia, including China, and then you are practically at the whole world. If you have the US, Russia, China, India, the Pacific, the Europeans, you need a global new security architecture. And that would mean the end of geopolitics. And I think that is the necessary step mankind has to take if we want to get out of this dilemma of potential world war for good.
There is a very interesting op-ed published in the French website Marianne by two prominent former officials of the Bank for International Settlements, where they suggested that France either leave NATO or, more importantly, Macron could make the pledge that he would veto Ukrainian entrance into NATO. But we're seeing a lot of voices coming out now. The two most interesting to me in terms of setting the record straight about the Russian demands for guarantee of security were statements from Roland Dumas, the former French foreign minister, and Jack Matlock, the former ambassador to Russia from the United States. Can you sort of characterize what the two of them had to say?
Yes, because, there is a historic truth. What happened in 1990 when the German unification was on the table, when the Soviet Union disintegrated. And then there's a narrative. And these two things are in absolute contradiction because the narrative says that all the tensions came from Russia because Russia annexed Crimea. And, but that is not what happened. And we have published from the Schiller Institute a chronology what actually happened and who started to break the promises which were given to Gorbachev at the time, that the NATO would not move 1 inch to the east. Now, we have published this chronology, and I would urge you, our viewers, if you haven't done it yet, please look at our website, look at this chronology. And it is extremely important that Jack Matlock already did that in the past by basically confirming exactly what we have been saying. Matlock was the US ambassador to Moscow at the time of this transformation. But now another person, another time witness spoke out, and that is Roland Dumas, who was the French foreign minister in the same period. And he, on a website called Les Crises, the crisis, he spoke out at length and described how, in discussions between he himself, Roland Dumas, Shevardnadze, the Soviet foreign minister, James Baker, the U.S. ambassador at the time, U.S. foreign secretary at the time, and actually also Genscher, there was a clear discussion that NATO would not move back. And he recalled that at that time the Soviets made two major demands. One was that the Soviet war statues, the heroes of the war, would remain untouched. And that secondly, that the NATO troops would not, when the Warsaw Pact disarmed, I mean, that's an unbelievable story, they disarmed deliberately, by free will. But the demand was that that would not be used by NATO to fill the vacuum and move in there. And according to Matlock, Roland Dumas, and several other people in the meantime, have who were there in the discussions basically confirmed, yes, such a promise was given. And that totally confirms what Putin said, that Russia was betrayed many, many times because NATO expansion occurred in several rounds, and now it's 30 additional NATO countries. And if Ukraine would ever be NATO, it would be the 31st, which is a clear lie. And therefore, all the color revolution and all the regime change efforts, the Orange Revolution, the Rose Revolution, I mean, all of that is part of the historical truth, including what happened in the coup in 2014 in the Maidan in February, which was a total orchestration and, suppressing the Russian people. And that is why the people in the Crimea in a referendum voted deliberately by free will that they wanted to be part of Russia. Now, that is exactly what happened in Kosovo. And therefore, I think it's very important that this record of the period, what followed post the collapse of the Soviet Union, is being set straight, and it's very good that Roland Dumas now joined the chorus of people to do so. And I would really urge everybody to correct your history in terms of what actually happened and who was the culprit for the deterioration of the relation. And then you will find it was not Russia.
Helga, in this broad picture, there are two other developments that loom large over what's happening. One is the ongoing financial disintegration, which was just commented on by the forecaster and hedge fund operator Grantham, who said that the financial crash is beginning. The other is the Russia-China agreement. So I wonder if you could just situate this strategic crisis in the context of these two significant developments.
Well, it's a good thing that now, for a long period of time, the sleepiness of the peace movement or the anti-war movement seems to have come to an end. And you have right now, on both sides of the Atlantic, lots of demonstrations and appeals where people, wake up to the war danger and they make appeals that this be stopped. They take to the streets, and that's useful. But it falls completely short because it does not address where the war danger comes from. Sure, the war danger comes from the military-industrial complex, who need their wars to keep their machine going, but you cannot separate the interest of the military-industrial complex from Wall Street, the City of London, Silicon Valley, and the fact is that the neoliberal financial system is blowing out. And the war danger comes from that, because there are some people in these circles who much rather risk, World War III than to allow that the multipolar world is developing, especially now with the rise of China and Russia being in a new strategic partnership, which is a completely new element in the situation. And, the war danger comes from the fact that these neoliberal circles just are experiencing their Waterloo, from production chains which don't function, inflation, collapsing infrastructure. Nothing is really functioning, and it is if the Federal Reserve is going ahead with their plans to taper, meaning the interest rates will be increased, you are risking an immediate chain reaction of collapses of bankrupt firms. And this is the powder keg on which we are sitting between Schiller and Charybdis, inflation going further out of control, and a chain reaction collapse, including that of the emerging markets. There is no solution. This system is finished. And the only solution would be to do exactly what Lyndon LaRouche suggested and proposed for many years, namely to have a complete reorganization of a bankrupt system, a global Glass-Steagall banking separation in the tradition of Glass-Steagall, then go to a Hamiltonian banking system, go back to the idea of a national bank in the tradition of Alexander Hamilton and set up a new Bretton Woods system, which provides for long-term, low-interest credit for development of the developing sector in particular. And that could be done very easily in cooperation with the Belt and Road Initiative. So a solution is eminently possible, but it would mean that the elites in the West, change. And I don't think that they are quite up to that, because they have they are so ideologically bound to this system, where in the last decades, basically after 71, the whole focus shifted more and more to monetarist games, money, speculative gains at the expense of the physical economy. And they think that they need this speculation, as their lifeline, which allows them to become millionaires and eventually billionaires and have huge yachts. And they don't want to give this up. And that is what is collapsing right now. This is what Jeremy Grantham says. The very speculative stocks have already collapsed 50%. The others are already down 12 or 25%. And he says the crash is on. And that may very well be. And these reforms pushed by my late husband are more urgent to be put on the agenda than ever before.
As you were just talking, I was thinking about the event we had last week, the Schiller Institute with the Russian International Affairs Council, where there was a very interesting comment from one of the participants, Graham Fuller, who said that the establishment is affected by a psychological trauma caused by the end of the unipolar era. Now, this is where the question of a new strategic architecture comes up. And we are going to be holding an event this Saturday to take that up. And Helga, I'd like you to say a little bit about what we're planning to do to give people an understanding that this is not pie in the sky. This is absolutely essential if we're going to survive and not allow the psychological trauma of a lost generation of billionaires bring the world to an end.
Yes, I can only invite you to come to this event on Saturday. We will have two panels. One on the question of, the evaluation, where do we stand with the war danger? Because, the danger is not as it was described by such people as Boris Johnson or, his likes. But there is an underlying war danger which comes from a completely wrong design, including, the idea of prolonged global warfare, nuclear warfare, as it is the basis of the global lightning maneuver which just took place. So there will be a discussion, a strategic evaluation. Where do we stand, especially also after this fateful Wednesday, the 16th. But I think that the second panel will be also extremely important, because we will discuss solutions, integrating Latin America with the Belt and Road Initiative and the United States, because the US and China must work together. There is no way how the world will come out of this without the United States and China finding a way to cooperate. Then naturally we will discuss the question of Afghanistan, which is more urgent than ever before, because the absolute incredible humanitarian crisis is still going on, and there is a huge mobilization by Afghani people worldwide who are extremely upset that Biden is stealing or tries to steal money which belongs to the Afghan people, not to the Taliban, but to the Afghan people. And the need to have a central bank in Afghanistan functioning. So the second panel will be on the discussion of the strategic significance of this new agreement between Russia and China, and how that can translate into building a more peaceful world. So you should definitely join and tune in and participate in our mobilization, because maybe people, after having gone through this roller coaster of war today or not today, maybe there is recognition awakening that we need to change the paradigm, if we want to have durable peace.
I would suggest people come out of their bomb shelters and watch the dialogue that we had last Thursday between the Schiller Institute and the Russian International Affairs Council to get a better picture of what's at stake in Afghanistan. And then register for the conference this Saturday, which you can do at theschillerinstitute.com. Helga, is there anything else you wanted to discuss?
Well, I think that, I think people have to have a sense that there is something one can do, and that the sentence, oh, one can't do anything anyway, that sentence should be forbidden. I made a joke many years ago. I said, if I'm Chancellor of Germany, I will put this sentence under punishment. Everybody who says this should be in the dungeon for 10 years, because once you believe that you can't do anything, then you leave the field of action to those people who are the evil ones. And naturally, when you are an individual and you look around you and you watch this totally controlled media, I mean, in Germany, it has reached a point of Goebbels-like, or Goebbels would be, totally envious about the perfection what they have done, in terms of, it's really bad. Actually, if you are an individual confronted with such a bombardment, you think there's nothing one can do. But, Schiller said famously, if you can't be a one, then attach yourself to a one. And I think that is very true. If an individual attaches himself or herself to a one, namely the Schiller Institute, then you can become extremely powerful, because then all the forces, of the individuals add to our power to actually move something. And I must say, if you compare the approach of the Schiller Institute to many, many other think tanks and organizations, we are not commentators. We have a vision. We know where the world should be in 10 years, in 50 years, in 100 years from now. And we are mobilizing many, many flanks and forces to accomplish that. And that is a very forward orientation, which is very optimistic.
Well, again, I want to thank you for your optimism, and I think it affects a lot of people who watch these videos, and people should share this video, make comments on it on the internet, and get it out to others so that more people have access to why it is that we can be optimistic even in the face of a horrendous situation in Afghanistan and a danger of a new war. So Helga, thanks for joining us this week, and we'll see you this Saturday.
Yes, I'm looking forward to it.